You are listening to Stump the Pastor, the show where you, the listeners, send us your Bible-related questions, and we attempt to answer them for you. I'm your host, Pastor Ellis Wedel, and today in the studio I have with me my friend Adam Hrankowski.
Boker Tov or Erev Tov, depending on whether you're listening in the morning or the evening.
What a surprise. This guy never has a shortage of hellos for us to have, that's for sure.
Good morning or good evening.
Well, thank you very much for that. And we also have Reg with us, but Reg isn't going to talk. He's just going to listen and tell us, make faces at us while we do our thing. So we have a question today that is probably a question that some people want to know the answer to, and it's going to take us a couple of at least a couple of it's going to take at least a couple of shows to be able to answer this fully, maybe more than a couple. But the question that came to us says this. It says, is our body the same as our soul? But I think when I read this, when it came in, I think that more accurately the question should be, do we have body, soul, and spirit?
Okay.
Or do we have just body and soul? Or do we have just body, soul, spirit, whatever, all three of them is just one unit?
Different names for the same thing, even, yeah. What are we made out of?
What?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And
what are we made out of?
That's really the question, right?
This is what is referred to as theological anthropology.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so we're going to try to answer this question, and there's a lot of information, and there's basically there's a few different views when it comes to this, and different groups that hold to different views. And so what we want to do is we want to start out with a view that's called monism, and monism is literally it comes from a Greek word that means one or alone, and it is the teaching that the spirit, soul, and body are essentially all the same thing, and that the spirit and soul do not exist without the body. Okay? So it's all one unit. You can call, those terms can be used interchangeably because it's all referring to the same thing.
Okay.
And there's the groups that hold to this view are people like the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, and Christadelphians. Some of you may have known them because they've come into town a few times. And so there's also this term soul sleep, which they talk about this because the way that gets intermixed is that, and the idea is that when you die, your body and soul, the whole thing goes to sleep until the resurrection.
Well, like we talked last week about what happens with animals.
Right.
Yeah.
So the soul doesn't go, or a soul or spirit or whatever, we haven't determined this yet, doesn't go to heaven, and the body goes into the ground. In this view, all of it goes into the ground, and then it sleeps until the time that the resurrection happens.
Hence the name monism. It's really all different aspects of the same thing.
Yeah. And so I have a quote here from King Henry, and King Henry said this. He said, "The souls that do depart, hence do sleep, being without all sense, feeling, and perceiving until the day of judgment. They do utter dissent from the right that is closed to us in Holy Scriptures." And so it seems as though King Henry
the sixth
had a view that was similar to this.
Okay. It's not a new idea.
No, it's not.
No.
It's been around a long time.
Yep.
So what I want to do here is I want to give a defense for monism.
Okay.
But then at the end of each point that's made in defense, I want to give what would be the remark that would counteract whatever it is that they're saying.
So we have a discussion.
Right. So here's the first thing that those who agree with monism would say. They say when the Bible speaks of death, it speaks in terms of sleeping. Okay, and there's a few verses that talk about this. I don't have all the verses here. We're not going to be able to go through all the verses because the Bible's a big thing. And if we went through them all, we would be here for a year going through all the verses related. So I just have a couple of verses.
And then people would start to experience soul sleep.
Well, yeah, some of them would be off and gone before, and they'd know the answer to this question long before we ever got to the answer. So here's a couple of verses that would talk about this. Acts 13:36, and then you want to read the next one first?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Okay, so Acts 13:36 says this. "For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid among his fathers and underwent decay." Okay, so we have this idea that David fell asleep when he died.
Okay, 1 Thessalonians 4:13-15. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep.
Yeah.
So he's using the term sleeping to refer to death.
Refer to death, yeah. And so so they would say, okay, well, this is very clear here, right? When we die, we go to sleep. We sleep until the time that Christ comes back. And I guess that would be, I mean, that seems very logical as far as being, the surface idea of what they're trying to say here, right? If you were just anybody was just reading it who never read the Bible before, that's what they would assume that it was saying.
Sure. Jesus, when he was going to raise the little girl from the dead, okay, he says, don't worry, she's only asleep.
Yeah.
Right. And okay, but now here's a point, because whatever you say, I'm going to argue against it. Okay. Okay. So, but the point is, then they laughed at him.
Yeah.
Right. But he was saying, oh, they're only asleep because he knew he was going to raise her from the dead. Right. So they didn't go, oh, well, he's asleep, but asleep means the same as dead. What are you talking about, Jesus? So perhaps we could argue here that it's using the metaphor of sleep, specifically over here in 1 Thessalonians.
Right.
Right. It's because it's a reminder that for the Christian, sleep isn't temporary. I mean, sorry, death is temporary,
right,
because there's going to be the resurrection.
Right.
So that
could
be the point. Yeah.
And that is the argument
Okay.
that those who have other views would hold against
Sure.
us, as far as this first point is concerned.
Okay.
That this is just a metaphor. It's not speaking literally, it's speaking metaphorically. The second point that those who would believe in monism would say is that those in the Old Testament showed no sign of belief in an intermediate state. They simply spoke of going to the place where all the dead go, the grave, which was called Sheol. Their hope was only in the resurrection. It wasn't in one day that their spirit would go to be somewhere else. Right? So we have a couple of verses that make reference to this. Job 17:13-16 says, if I look for Sheol as my home, and Sheol, once again, that's that word that's used for the grave or the place where the dead would go. I make my bed in darkness. If I call to the pit, you are my father. To the worm, my mother and my sister. Where now is my hope, and who regards my hope? Will it go down with me to Sheol? Shall we together go down into the dust? So there's no mention there about, I'm going to be with God or whatever. It's just I'm going to be in the ground.
Okay. And then Genesis 50, verse 25, says, Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here.
Yeah.
What was your point in
this
citing that passage?
Yeah, this idea that Joseph doesn't make any reference here either about the fact that, you're just there's a separation of spirit and body. You'll just be carrying my bones, and the rest of me will be somewhere else. The idea is that you're going to be taking me from this one place to the other, and it's all one thing.
Something I think we are going to get to a little bit later on in this discussion as well is I think that the Bible says a lot less about what we would call the intermediary state. What we believe in the resurrection. Okay, I think most Christians believe in the resurrection. Okay, what goes on between death and resurrection, I don't know if the Bible says as much about it, and some of the things are metaphorical, and we could argue that they're parables, and this is why there's so much discussion and disagreement about this sort of thing. And there may be some, through our traditions, some filling in of the blanks, and it's hard to go, where does the storytelling start and the Bible actual what the Bible says stop, because I think that the focus has been, particularly in the Old Testament,
Yep.
on what is expected of us, how are we to live our lives. And even the Old Testament doesn't say as much about the hope for the life to come as the New Testament does.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, we take into account, too, what is called progressive revelation, right?
Yep.
And that they're making a point here that in the Old Testament they didn't have much reference to this intermediate state. But we do see some more in the New Testament. And the idea that God doesn't give us all the information from the very beginning. You know, Adam knew a lot less than Moses did. And Moses knew less than what David did. And David knew less than what Apostle Paul did. And all through the Bible, as this relationship with God grew, God revealed more and more of himself to those people who he was in relationship with.
Now, in defense of the monism, something that I think you'll hear is in Genesis, Genesis, it says, when God created Adam, Adam became a living soul. And that word nephesh is what he became. He breathed life into him, and he became a living soul. And so he became a living soul. So he doesn't have a soul; he became a soul. Right. So this is the argument. But it could be, and I think the point that you're wanting to make here is that later on in the Bible, it uses these terms differently. And so is it a development of an idea or a greater understanding?
Yeah, I think I think that's the case. I think God sometimes introduced concepts but didn't explain them a whole lot. And so they knew something was, about this. But as that relationship grew and as the years went on, God, as people grew closer to him, revealed more and more about what this was about.
And just from a linguistic standpoint, you've got the Old Testament. It's written over a period of hundreds of years.
Yep.
Within that period of time, you're going to see changes in how words are used. Just like in English, you're going to read a piece of English writing written 500 years ago, and then use how that vocabulary is used to say this is what Ellis Wedel meant when he was on Stump the Pastor in 2016. So it can get complicated.
It can get very complicated. I'm just good for a second. There's a couple more arguments here that monism has, but before we go any further, I'm going to stop for a second because sometimes, Adam and I, we love these discussions.
Yeah.
We love talking about this stuff, but sometimes we get into our discussions and people out there. We've been told that sometimes there's people out there who might be scratching their head going like, I don't know much about the Bible, and what they just said really confused me.
Okay.
So what I want to do is I want to just really, before we even go any further, break this down for those people who might be listening that haven't got a background in this. The question that's being asked is, well, I mentioned this at the beginning. The Bible talks about the body, the soul, and the spirit. It makes reference to all three of those things. The question is, are we a body, soul, and spirit, all one unit, which is what monism teaches? Are we a body and then a soul and a spirit, so there's three parts of us, and each part has a separate function? Or are we a body and then a soul and a spirit are the same thing? And so it's just two words that mean the same thing, but there's two parts to us, and they both have a different function. And that's really the question we're trying to answer here as far as the Bible's concerned. Which one is it that the Bible says we are?
And I think it's good to look at this from a experiential point of view, like what's going to happen to me when I die.
Right.
So when I die, right, am I like an animal, or am I like, do I just because my body has ceased to function? Is it like being asleep? Or while I'm waiting for the resurrection, am I experiencing something because myself is separate from my body? That's the question. And you know what? I found in my upbringing there was so much emphasis on that, what I call the intermediary state, as if the body didn't matter. And you really see so much of that. Oh, the body doesn't matter; it's just a shell. And then I'd go to church and I would recite the creeds, right? With these ancient statements of faith. And I'd get to the part about the resurrection of the dead, and I go, well, what's that about? because in popular thought, you go to heaven, you get your harp, and your body stays in the dust.
Yeah, or it's that body stays in the dust, but God creates a new one, the new better body,
a new better body. Yeah,
but it has nothing to do with the old one that just died.
But I really feel that the Bible puts the emphasis of our redemption on the resurrection, which happens at the end of the world. So whether we experience the time between now and then is really part of this question.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So this first one we're going through is this idea that all three of these things are just the same thing. But
okay.
So the third point that they would make, these people that believe in monism, would say that many biblical writers explicitly say that there's no intermediate state. This is the argument they'll make. Now we might agree or disagree with that, but this is their argument. Okay.
Yep.
And so Psalm 6:5 says, "For there is no mention of you in death. In Sheol, who will give you thanks?" And so there's this idea that that David, the psalmist here, is saying that, you know what, in dying, we're just gone, right? Nothing's going to happen after that.
And then Psalm 30, verse 9, "What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit?" Pit being a reference to the grave.
Right.
"Will the dust praise you? Will it declare your faithfulness?"
Right. So there's nothing living or able to do anything once you're dead, physically dead.
Okay.
Psalms 88, 3-5 says, "For my soul has had enough troubles, and my life has drawn near to Sheol. I am reckoned among those who go down to the pit. I have become like a man without strength, forsaken among the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and they are cut off from your hand." Like there's an ending there, right?
Yeah.
As soon as you die, it's just done.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I should comment that within Judaism, there's a much broader opinions. I mean, it seems to me within Christianity, orthodoxy is much more narrow. What I mean is it's more defined what things are believed, whereas within Judaism, it's
a lot wider.
It's a lot wider. It's a lot wider, and you're still welcome if you believe this thing or that thing or that thing.
Yeah.
So curiously enough, I read a book by a Jewish author speculating whether there's life after death, whereas I would not expect to see this from a Christian author.
No,
you'd go. I mean, if you saw that in a Christian bookstore, you'd go, "What's this doing here on the shelf?
Is this a Christian? What's going on?"
That's right. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's
And part of my point is because they're dealing with if you didn't have the New Testament, you'd be looking at scriptures like this, and there isn't as much information about.
Yeah.
And there really does seem to be the implication that once you're dead, even in this.
And we have a couple other verses here that say the same kind of thing. I mean, it just goes on that way, right? Ecclesiastes is a huge one here. But understanding that, I mean, we've talked about this before.
Sure.
The way you read a book is very different.
Yeah.
The books are all different. So Ecclesiastes, you would not be going to Ecclesiastes to find out the best way to understand a particular thing, because this is a guy who's in the midst of depression, bad, whatever, however we would term it today. He's not a happy fella, right? He's writing out of real sorrow.
This isn't. You don't want to read this the way you read the statement of faith from the church,
right?
And so you where you go, oh look, here's a bunch of verses in Psalms. You don't read it the same way. And then, having said that, the Old Testament does talk about an afterlife specifically.
Yes,
it does. Daniel chapter 12 comes to mind. I won't quote it, but something to look up, because we're getting the impression that it's not in the Old Testament. It's just not as explicit.
And those who would argue against this particular point, that it doesn't mention an intermediate state in the Old Testament, would say that the intermediate state was not something that was spoken of a lot in the Old Testament, but these biblical writers didn't say that there wasn't an intermediate state. All they did was talk about that these are the things we can't do once we die. It's not saying there is no intermediate state that we become a part of. And the basic message in what they're saying is that after we die, we can't proclaim knowledge or wisdom or praise to others on earth about what the Lord has done. Not so much about we're not going to do anything, but we're no longer able to do these things that we used to do while we were living
on earth.
Right.
Okay.
The fourth thing that those who believe in monism would say, they'd say the idea of an intermediate state is of Greek origin. The Hebrews believed in a holistic self in which the hope was in the resurrection. The Greeks downplayed the role of the body and the material self, believing that death was a release from this confinement. Those who see a plurality in the constitution of human nature, in other words, those who see that there's a body, a soul, a spirit, something that's different, or that there's multiple parts, read the Bible through Greek eyes, failing to see that when the Bible speaks of the body, soul, and spirit, it's the same as when it speaks of the mind, heart, and soul. It's all the same thing.
And this is an argument made by Edward Fudge. Okay.
Yeah.
Edward Fudge, which I didn't know I was going to refer to him. He wrote Google him. he wrote. I would say
he wrote Google him?
No, he didn't write Google him. Okay. If you Google him, you will find his book, which I've actually got. I've got on my phone here. He is an evangelical Christian. Okay, he's a lawyer actually. So imagine this is how he reads the text.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's written a book, which I can't think of the name of it, advocating the conditionalist point of view. Okay, which doesn't have to go with this way of thinking, but it often goes with this way of thinking. We were talking about hell a few weeks ago,
yep.
And so he believes that hell is ceasing to exist, and so the people who are saved, they receive something more than, before you're born, you don't exist at all. So people who are saved and go to heaven, well, they're getting something more, but the bodies of the ones who aren't saved, they just stay dead. They just stay dead.
Right. So they don't, like, there's no punishment for them or whatever. It's just,
they
just cease to exist.
The punishment is it's a failure to get a reward.
Right.
There might be some sort of hell that's temporary from their point of view. So Edward Fudge, rethinkinghell.com. I think it's .com or .org. I'm not sure, but Rethinking Hell, what I would call evangelical conditionalism, which is not my point of view, but a place to look at to understand these arguments. And the reason why I thought of Fudge is because he makes that he thinks the idea of the immortal soul came from Plato. That's his argument.
Okay. And those who would argue against this particular argument would say that the fact that it might, the idea that it came from the Greeks and so it's wrong, they would say, well, that's kind of that's a false argument, because not everything that the Greeks believed was wrong.
Sure.
And so just because it came from the Greeks doesn't mean that the view that we could be multiple parts is not the case.
Okay.
They would just say it's not a very good argument if you're going to make that argument. The fifth thing that somebody would say who believes in monism, modern science has demonstrated that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the neurological activity of the brain and the feelings, memories, personalities, and attitudes of a person. This makes the existence of the soul or spirit not only unnecessary but untenable. Once this brain ceases activity, the person ceases to exist. And I have a quote here from William Rowe, Philosophy of Religion, and he says, "The evidence that we have indicates that our mental life is dependent on certain bodily processes, particularly those associated with the brain. We know, for example, that damage to various parts of the brain result in cessation of certain kinds of conscious states, memories, thought processes, and the like. It seems eminently reasonable to infer from this that consciousness is dependent for its existence on the existence and proper function of the human brain. When at death the brain ceases to function, the reasonable inference is that our mental life ceases as well." And the reason that this is a question with regard to this is because some people believe, well, our feelings and all that stuff, that's what we would refer to as our spirit.
Sure.
Right? And so even though our body would die, our memories and all those things still carry on in our spirit. But they're saying here that, well, we have reason to believe that, well, when our brain isn't functioning properly, which is a physical part of us, then our memories and things are inhibited, which wouldn't make sense. If the spirit is still functioning properly, then all those things should still be good.
Now, I would argue that that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it doesn't have to follow. But perhaps that argument would be better made when we're discussing dualism.
Yes, but we're not going to go there till next week.
That's right.
But we will tell you what the argument is against this.
Okay.
Those who would argue against monism would say, while it's true that the brain is intricately linked to all aspects of the whole person, this does not prove that it is the whole person. The body is part of what a person is, but this does not necessarily mean that it is all that a person is. And so, yeah, there's a lot of this is semantics, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so you're like, it's very fine differences, or very fine. There's not a big gap between one belief to the other. It's looking at it in very fine detail.
Well, let me make one argument here against monism and in favor of dualism. Dualism being the idea that there's two, okay,
or three.
Or
dualism carries both of them.
Okay, and I call it the hardware-software distinction. Okay, so if we think of our bodies as being like the computer.
Yeah.
Okay. If the computer shuts down, right, it can't run the software anymore. But yet the software exists. The software is an intangible entity. Yeah. I mean, yes, it can't exist apart from the computer, right? But that doesn't mean that it can't run in another way. Okay. I'm being really.
I think that's a great. I think that's a great example. And you could take any part of the computer and say the same thing with regard to it, like the hard drive. Well, hard drive is useless without the rest of the computer to run it. But at the same time, the hardware, the hard drive does exist on its own. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can go to a store and buy a separate hard drive,
and that software could be run in the cloud.
Right.
Right. But yet, of course, the cloud is still. So my point is the Ellis Wedel software, right? Yes, while you're alive, and if your brain is damaged, then yes, the software running won't work so well. But that doesn't mean that the software can't run elsewhere
or separate. Yes.
Or separately.
Yeah.
Or separately.
That's a great example. You just think of that on your own just now?
No, I've thought of that like years ago.
Oh, well,
yeah.
I've going to be really impressed.
You're going to be really impressed. I should have said this just occurred to me.
Yeah, that's good. Anything else you want to say with regard to this before we end? No,
I think I could start and then we'd go on for another hour and then people would say, "What's going on?"
Okay, well then let's end for now. So we've gone over this today. We've gone over monism. Next time when we get together, we're going to talk about dualism. Which contains both of these views of there being a body and a soul / spirit.
Right.
So soul, spirit, the same, or body, soul, and spirit, three separate things.
Okay, something else.
We want to thank you for joining with us today. Be sure to tune in next Sunday at 8:30 for Stump the Pastor. If you have a question about the Bible or Christianity, please send it in to my email, which is pastorwedel@outlook.com, and Wedel is spelled Wedel. If your question is chosen to go on the air, you will receive a free gift, compliments of Heartland Baptist Church and CFIS FM. Until next time, may God richly bless you, and so long.
Hasta la vista.